Hello and welcome to the third chapter of the Model Kits for Beginners learning course, where I teach you how to build and paint your scale model kit with an airbrush. In this chapter, we're going to be filling and sanding any imperfections on our model and focusing on hiding seam lines and filling gaps. We're also going to be looking at rescribing some panel lines. Now, these techniques can be challenging, but stick with it and I'll show you the way. In the last chapter, we completed up to step 36 and cut out the landing gear but left them separated. Now we're going to look at fixing any imperfections on the model and preparing it for painting. Looking further into the instructions, we can see that there are lots of small parts to be added. In my opinion, it's easier to leave these off during this stage, as we're going to be working in a way that could lead to them snapping off. So let's look at these areas that need work, starting with the main one, the wing roots. Wing root gaps are a very common issue and can be caused by both your construction and the kit itself, but it's quite simple to fix. We'll also fix the gap under the canopy as discussed in the last episode using the same techniques. We have a few seam lines to make disappear, notably on the nose, top and bottom, and on the tail. Finally, we have the wing leading edges. These will be sanded smooth. Let's start at the leading edges, as this will be the most simple process. Begin by carefully removing any excess sprue with a blade or a file. Then get your firm but coarse sanding stick and begin to smooth off the area. Make sure to rotate the stick around the edge to prevent you from flattening the face. Work your way along the wing with light pressure and then move to a less coarse sanding sponge. Again, using light pressure to smooth the edge. A sanding sponge is key here as it will conform to the shape of the surface. Now do the same for the tail and the nose seams, working your way from coarse to fine sanding sponges. Remember to rotate the sanders around the joint so that we don't flatten the original shape. On the nose, we're levelling the two halves ready for the next process where we're going to make the seam disappear. In some cases, sanding it down is enough, but I'm going to show you the full process as a demonstration. The two fillers I'm going to use here are Vallejo Plastic Putty and Mr. Surfacer 500 Primer. Surfacer 500 is a very thick primer that can be used to fill surface imperfections. Not to fill gaps, but to provide another layer on top of a small scratch, chip or uneven surface, or in our case, two halves that need blending together. It can be brushed on and then once dry, gently sanded away. Vallejo Plastic Putty is more of a thick, tacky mixture that can fill gaps and be wiped away. It never fully hardens, so it can't be sanded easily. The wing root gap is the perfect situation for this product. Let's start with the Surfacer 500 as it's going to take some time to dry. Using an old brush with a small tip, dab it along the seam until it's covered. You don't want to put on so much that it creates a mountain, but just enough that you've covered the seam and to the sides. This process sometimes takes more than one go to fully hide the seam, so don't worry if it's not perfect the first time. Do this above and below the nose and to any other areas that you think you might need it. Set it aside to dry for around 30 minutes or until it loses the wet look. Whilst that's drying, I'm going to deal with the wing root. You'll need a cotton bud and some water for this, so have them ready. Start by making sure that the nozzle is clear and the putty flows nicely. Then while squeezing, run it along the root with the nozzle angled such that it pushes the putty into the gap. It's best to do it in one swift motion, so be generous with the squeezing and put plenty of putty in the gap. This doesn't need to be neat. Now with your cotton bud dampened in water, start to wipe away the excess. Try not to dig it into the gaps as it will scoop the putty out. Ideally you want it to be left flush on the surface. Here's a diagram showing the cross section of the wing root. We have the wing root after the putty application, what we're trying to achieve, and what happens when we press too hard. You may notice that the putty dries slightly and becomes almost rough and flaky. To stop this, just add more water to the cotton bud to keep the putty wet. If you're not happy with the filling, you can simply repeat the process. We don't have to wait for it to dry. If the putty goes into the panel lines or areas that you don't want it, you can scrape it out with tweezers or anything you can find. It's water soluble, so you could even wash it off. Going back to the Mr. Surfacer 500, now that it's dry, we can see that whilst it's dried, it's also shrunk, and the seam line is now visible through the filled area. However, this does not mean that it hasn't worked. Make sure that you wait until it's absolutely dry before sanding. Begin, as before, with the coarse sanding sponge with light pressure. The coarse sander will make the first attack and broadly level the filler. Try not to overdo it. We only want to take a stab at leveling the surface and not completely remove the filler. Then move up the grit and begin to blend the filler into the plastic. Patience is key. Continually check the smoothness with your finger and remove the sanding dust to make sure you can see exactly what's being done. It's normal to have to repeat this process. We'll use the first coat of primer over the whole aircraft to show us the results of the filling. It's likely that we'll need to apply more in some places, in fact I'm expecting it. But before we can airbrush on some primer, we've got to protect the cockpit. We're going to use Tamiya masking tape to seal off the cockpit from the coming paint layers. Now we're presented with the option of whether to add the front canopy or not. We can't add the rear sliding canopy yet as the camouflage continues underneath, so in any case this needs to be added at the end. But for the front, you could leave it separate and then glue it on at the end too. However, you'd be betting on the fit being good enough even after all the paint layers, and if not, you'll be left with some gaps and it might not look the best. So the preferred option is to take some time to fit the canopy now and fill and sand any imperfections, making it look more like it's blended into the fuselage and not a separate piece stuck on top. We also need to think about how to access the inside of the canopy after painting and whilst it's attached. Sometimes the various layers of paints, varnishes and chemicals can cause some slight fogging on the inside of the canopy that you don't notice until you've removed the masking tape. Luckily, it can be easily cleaned up with a cotton bud, but we need to make sure that we can actually do that at the end. The only thing I can see on this kit that might get in the way is the gun sight, so I'll add this with tweezers at the end. Now we can remove the front canopy E10 from the clear sprue. Be extra cautious as we want to keep the canopy parts nice and clear and free from scratches or cracks. The clear plastic tends to be more brittle than the standard parts, so make sure your blade is new and the cutters are sharp, or else you may end up crushing the plastic and cracking it. Now we can check the fit and see if we need to do any major work on it. But it looks good to me, so hopefully your kit will be the same. Next, we need to mask up the clear parts in a way that leaves the canopy frame exposed to be painted, as we can see on the instructions. You can identify where the frame is by finding the raised areas on the part. You can go online and buy some canopy masking sets, which are pre-cut masking stickers that fit perfectly onto the canopy. These are incredibly useful, but cost around £10 depending on the size of the kit. So I'm going to show you the old-fashioned way of doing things, which requires a lot of patience and a steady hand. If you have the budget, I recommend picking up the canopy masking sets, but if you're crazy like me and you enjoy making life extremely difficult for yourself, then try this technique. Firstly, get yourself a fresh knife blade and a sharpened pencil. Mechanical pencils are a good option for this. Put some tape on one of the panels, and then using a pair of tweezers or your fingernail, push the tape tight into the frame until you can clearly see the outline defined through the tape. Then grab your pencil and lightly trace the edge of the frame onto the tape. Once you have a clear line, remove the tape and put it onto a clean cutting mat or any shiny smooth surface that you don't mind cutting into. With your fresh blade, just cut out the shape. You can do this however you like. I used a ruler for the straight lines. You shouldn't need to apply much pressure at all. If you use an old blade and heavy pressure, you'll probably rip the tape and you'll have to start again. Now just slap the shape into its spot and you'll have a nicely masked panel. Repeat this for all the other areas, checking you don't miss that small clear part right on top of the front canopy. The small panel on top will be quite tricky to trace and cut out, so leave it until the end, then you've had some practice. Don't hesitate to add additional pieces to the panels if you're not happy with your shape. I added a small straight piece to the right side as I wasn't satisfied with the front edge. This is a great skill to have, so practice it when you can, but if you really don't enjoy it or feel confident doing it, you have the excellent alternative of canopy masking sets. And now finally, we can glue the canopy on. This is really as simple as just using a sensible amount of glue, or the right type. A lot of people struggle with their clear parts and have issues gluing them on when they first start out. This is usually because they're using the bulky cement tubes and applying way too much. You can buy PVA type glues that dry clear and are designed for clear parts, but honestly I don't think you need to. Just take your time and use a controlled amount of glue. My choice would be extra thin cement. This means you don't have to fumble around trying to stick the clear piece on and risk getting gluey fingerprints everywhere, but instead you can carefully place the part where you want it and then dab on a small amount of glue to hold it in place whilst you go around the joint fusing it to the fuselage. You could also use the extra thin quick set if you feel confident enough. Place the canopy into its position, making sure it lines up left, right, forward and back. Then holding it firmly in place, apply a small amount of extra thin to the front joint. You will be able to see the glue spreading out through the joint if you look closely. This will help you judge how much glue you need to apply. Once you can feel it's holding firm, then add some to the sides. Leave it for around 10 minutes to fully dry. Now we need to finish masking the cockpit by closing it off completely. For this, all I do is put some tape on the canopy frame and the cockpit sill, and then use the fresh knife blade from earlier to cut around the outline. Tidy it up with scissors if you need to. For the back side and seat, we essentially wrap the tape around it. You can always go back and touch up any exposed areas at the end. I had a small gap either side of the canopy left over from earlier, so I used Vallejo putty again to fill it, using the same procedure. And finally, before we can prime the aircraft, we need to cover up the wheel wells and the radiators. For that, I'll use some old packaging foam, but you could use blue tack, tape, tissue paper or anything that will sit in the gap and stop the paint. With the foam, I just try and guess what size and shape I'll need and then keep trimming it down until it fits in snug. Please make a note that before we put any primer on the aircraft, we need to apply a coat of cockpit green to the front canopy, so that when we look at it from the inside, it's the correct colour. The primer then goes on top. As you can see here, I completely forgot to do this, so don't make the same mistake I did. We used Mr. Surfacer 500 as the liquid filler, and we'll use Mr. Surfacer 1200 or 1500 to paint the aircraft. The numbers represent viscosity and smoothness of finish. 1200 is plenty smooth enough and will go down very slightly thicker than 1500, which is helpful as it'll fill any small scratches left over from the sanding. Before we apply the primer, I'm blowing off any dust with the airbrush and having a final check over the surface for any dirt, greasy spots or anything that might show through the paintwork. You can also use a soft bristled brush as a duster. I've mixed it 50-50 with Mr. Leveling Thinner, and I'll be airbrushing at 15 to 20 psi, applying light, even coats. It'll take 2 or 3 coats to get a solid uniform colour, but that's what we want. It dries pretty quick, but just give it a few minutes before handling. You should now be able to see any imperfections and how well we managed to fill the seams. Don't be put off if you still have lots of issues. The first coat of primer is purely there to show us what we need to do. Let's look at the nose area, as this is where the big work was done. We can see a couple things. mainly that I didn't sand it down enough and we still have the outline of the filler. Another thing is there are some very small bubbles, but luckily both can be fixed easily. The tail looks nice and I'm happy with the filling work. The leading edges have been smoothed nicely, but there's a small gap that needs to be filled. For the nose, I'm going to sand it down some more, and hopefully that will get rid of the bubbles too. If not, I'll just add some more surface of 500. I'm going to start with the higher grit sponges, as we only want to take away a very small layer. So take your time, we're only trying to fix the issues and not start the whole process again. Once you're happy with all the filling and sanding, we can look to repair the panel lines that we've destroyed in the process. Rescribing panel lines can seem very daunting to a beginner, and in some situations it is quite challenging. But for us, we're only doing some nice simple straight lines on the tail, so you'll be fine. Here's a range of tools we can use to achieve this. From left to right, a curved blade, a razor saw with very fine teeth, a small pin and a big pin, our scalpel, and the Tamiya scribing tool with a special scribing blade. Some people also use tape as a guide, but that's optional. The way I do it for straight lines on curve shapes is use the scalpel to score the surface. Because it's a smooth and rigid blade, you can essentially roll it over the surface and it will stay pretty straight. Then once we've got a shallow groove or a score line in the plastic, we can use that as a guide for the scribing tool or the fine razor saw. Either of which works well, but you may get a very slightly different finish from both. The key to scribing is light but intentional pressure, and making sure that we hold both the blade and the kit nice and firm so our hands don't slip. You can also rotate the part and let the tool glide over the surface. It might take a couple of passes to get right. Be careful not to go too deep. Try and replicate the kit's panel lines and use them as a reference. Once you've rescribed the panel lines and you're happy with the filling and sanding work, the kit is pretty much ready for paint. But now we just need to get the remaining pieces ready. Looking closely at the landing gear, we can see that on the struts we have a slight mould seam, or a very slightly raised line. This is from where the two halves of the moulding blocks to make the kit are sealed together. Now this isn't always visible in the end, but it's a good idea to get rid of it where you can. In this case, I'm going to use the blade to scrape it away. We've also got some on the wheels, so we need to gently sand it back without destroying the tread details. Now moving on to the propeller and spinner, prep this assembly the same as before, but focus on sanding the sprue connections away neatly, as you'll want this part to be smooth and nicely finished. You may also want to sand each blade, as mine came slightly off. The plastic was a bit uneven and lumpy. Treat each blade as we did with the wing leading edges. Let's have a look at the small pieces we're yet to add. For example, the parts just behind the cockpit. I've chosen to leave them on the sprue whilst I paint them. And I've gone around and marked each piece with a Sharpie to make it easier to see when I'm airbrushing. You could also remove them all and put them on the cotton bud sticks with blue tack, but it's a bit harder when they're this small. But this is entirely down to personal preference. Now it's really just a case of getting all the remaining pieces cut off and cleaned up ready for painting, however you see fit. For the main canopy, get it cleaned up carefully and try to sand the sides smooth, because the sprue will have left a slight protrusion. Then for the masking, we can use the same tape, but this time cut it up into small strips about 1 millimeter wide. When masking tape is very narrow, it will bend and curve, so we can just use it to go around the outline of the canopy and then fill in the rest with the larger patches of tape. If you haven't already done so, apply the final layer of primer over any areas that you did more work to, so that we're left with a uniform primer layer over the whole aircraft, and any gaps and seam lines have been dealt with. You could also use primer on the landing gear and the propeller if you wanted to. And that concludes the third chapter. We filled and sanded away any imperfections, and now we're left with a complete Spitfire aircraft ready to be painted in the next chapter.